Hi, everyone. My name is Jim Pikarski, and I teach meditation and give Dharma talks here in Venice, Florida at the Blue Lotus Meditation Center. Today, what I would like to talk about is 4 basic ways to realize Buddha nature. Now, Buddha nature can also be called our true nature, Christ consciousness, the God within and without. There's a lot of different names for it. However, all traditions point to the same thing. To understand this, I think first what I would like to do is present an analogy. And by using the analogy, we can see how we transform ourselves. This is a story taken from Buddhist teachings. Someone drops a large lump of gold on the ground and it gets covered up with dirt for decades. And someone builds a small house there. A poor woman moves in. And she's quite poor and hungry. Someone with second sight sees that there's gold in the ground and tells the poor woman. She digs in the yard, finds a dirty rock, and washes it off. Now, if you saw that this poor starving woman had this gold buried in her yard, how insistent would you be for her to dig it up? How happy would you be when she found it and realized that her life would change? You would encourage her to dig it up and wash the precious gold to remove all the dirt and mud from it. The gold in this situation represents our true nature, which is golden and radiant. And it's there and we don't see it. We don't see it. It's not like the gold is calling to her from the ground. She has to have it pointed out to her. Now, actually, our true nature is a little more helpful in that way. A lot of times it'll bring things in our life to help us learn. But still, we need teachings and we need it pointed out to us. Because we can't see our true nature, this is like the dirt that's covering it. We need to learn how to remove that dirt also. Then by uncovering it, we remove the dirt and clay that covers it. The gold becomes revealed in its full glory. And the thing about gold is gold doesn't really change much. Gold is just there. It's not affected. It doesn't interact with the elements. It's pretty inert, and it just stays the way it is, radiant. It just needs to be cleaned. There are many analogies to this, and gold is one of them. Gold really is an analogy to the radiant nature of our true nature and the fact that it sticks around. It just doesn't change so easily. It's also a good analogy in the sense that we can talk about uncovering it in the sense of getting rid of the dirt and clay that may cover it. But other examples exist too. The sky and clouds. The sky is the spacious nature of our true nature, and the clouds are the temporary obscurations that stop us from seeing it. We can also use the space in a room. The space in the room is always there. It may be filled up with furniture. You can change the furniture. You can do anything. You can destroy the room, and still that space will be there. Space is impervious to change, whereas everything else changes. So all things will appear in that space. And this is just like our awareness or our true nature. All things will appear in our awareness. Our awareness is radiant, it's vast like the sky, and it contains everything like space. So, using this analogy, let's talk about 4 different ways to reveal this true nature to ourselves and become realized in our true nature. So the first thing we need to do is we need first set of techniques, and these are actually the most common techniques, is to remove our mistaken and limited ideas through insight. This is the most common way of teaching. We remove the things that are obscuring our true nature. We do not, in the analogy, we do not need to create the gold, the sky, or the space. It's already there. We need to remove what is obscuring them. So in the case of the gold, we need to remove the dirt and the clay. In the case of the sky, we need to remove the the clouds in the analogy of space. We just need to pay attention to the space. We're so focused on paying attention to the objects in a room, we don't notice the space. So these obscurations, these things that get in the way, are actually mistaken beliefs and mental tendencies. They're not something that's solid. They're not something that is, anything but thoughts, basically. Either deeply held thoughts or just thoughts passing through our mind. And the thing about thought is that if we have a mistaken belief, the cure for it is insight. So if we think that something is not true, is true, then when we see that it's true, it'll just drop away. An example that I use is Santa Claus. At some point in my life, I really believed in Santa Claus. And then one day I saw through that it wasn't Santa Claus that was bringing my presents, it was my mother and father. As soon as I saw through that, Santa Claus was done. I mean, I just did not believe in Santa Claus anymore. So insight removes ignorance, and it removes it completely. Trying doesn't necessarily work. The only trying we can do is to examine, to see. Trying and fighting against something like our own minds or something does not work. That's all more mistaken beliefs and activity of the limited self. So it is seeing and insight, not doing, that really changes things. Spiritual teachings are part of this particular, removing our mistaken and limited ideas through insight. Because spiritual teachings remove our ignorance and give us a clearer picture of reality. They're really designed, the most effective ones, to really challenge the way we see the world and make sure that we see it in a more helpful way. So as we study spiritual teachings and as we look and see through our mistaken ideas, this gradually dissipates the clouds and it dissipates the obscurations, our own mental and emotional obscurations. So the main tools in this category are teachings and inquiry. Because the number of mistaken ideas we can have about our existence is endless, teachings are many, and there are many, many, many kinds of teachings. But this represents one of the ways that we can uncover our true nature. Because if we get rid of the obscurations, just like if the woman washes the gold and gets rid of the dirt and clay, she will be able to see the true nature of the gold that she has and be able to take advantage of it. The second general type of techniques that are used for realization are inducing an experience of our true nature. So this is really about inducing a spiritual experience so we can see what it's like. Sometimes this is very simple, like just being in nature. Now, a person who in nature, they can feel the vastness of nature, they can feel the purity of nature, and these qualities reflect qualities within their true nature. So they get a sense of our true nature just by being out in nature and feeling the peace of it. We can also experience silence, stillness, meditation, samadhi, which is basically meditating until your mind becomes still. Sufi dancing, chanting, mantra. Probably the most common type of this, even more common than meditation, is devotion. Devotion seems to be the main practice of many religions around the world. So people, even in Buddhism, there are a lot of people that mainly practice just devotion to the Buddha and are not involved so much in inquiry. It's kind of the easiest thing to do, and it's really simple, so people can be very devoted. And the thing about devotion, if your devotion is strong enough, what will happen is that you will experience an altered state, and the altered state will be very peaceful and open and very warm. The problem with inducing states is that when you induce a state, it's not necessarily doesn't really have necessarily have insight. So it tends to come and go. Um, and this happens a lot of times with people. If you're looking at nature, you feel good while the nature's there. And then as you get back in the city, you start feeling maybe a little overwhelmed by the traffic. The same thing with spiritual experiences. People have a spiritual experience and then they'll go back to their normal way of functioning. Even meditation. People who will get deeply into meditation a lot of times will feel good right after they meditate or during their meditation. And then afterwards, life starts invading again. And they start feeling the stress of life. So, one of the problems and limitations of this approach, let me say the positives first. The positives is that you get a taste of it. You get used to it. You start feeling the qualities of your true nature, the peace and the joy and all those things. And the limitation is that a lot of times we take that experience and then we bring it back to the ego's perspective. Oh, I had an experience of my true nature. We interpret it that way rather than that's really who I am, and all these thinking about who I am is just nonsense. So we tend to interpret these, and the ego kind of takes control again, and just puts it in the ego's little box of spiritual experiences. So one of the things about when we get in a spiritual experience, no matter what, chanting or whatever else, if it's not paired with an insight into our true nature, it's not going to stick around. It's going to come and go. And a lot of people these days talk about non-abiding spiritual experiences and abiding spiritual experiences. My feeling is spiritual experiences abide and stick with us because they are paired with deep insight. Because, people say insight into one's true nature. Sometimes these spiritual experiences are unbidden. They just come to us, and they can come to people who aren't even on the spiritual path. They'll just, there's a thing in the Bible about Saul being struck by the Holy Spirit as he was on his way to Damascus. And then all of a sudden he was converted on the spot. It was a profound spiritual experience. And these profound spiritual experiences can happen to anyone. But again, these are typically not abiding because the person has these and yet doesn't have the insight yet. So they have to gain the insight and continue to purify their minds. Because as they purify their minds, what happens is that the cloud cover gets less and less dense, so we're more likely to be able to see what's true. There are recent exceptions to this non-abiding experience. Two people in the 20th century that I know about, there's probably many more. One is Ramana Maharshi. Ramana Maharshi, at a very young age, just all of a sudden realized his true nature and left home and stayed on a mountain, a spiritual mountain, for the rest of his life. And he was perfectly content, and he was deeply realized. He was a very influential person in the world. Another person that this happened to is Eckhart Tolle. Now, you may or may not read Eckhart Tolle, but the amazing thing about Eckhart Tolle is that he was a pretty troubled individual, a depressed individual. And then all of a sudden he had this spiritual experience. And when he had that spiritual experience, it was paired with an insight. And that insight made it an abiding spiritual experience. So he just never went back to his normal, separated views of the ego. So these are two experiences that are very rare. Most people go through the experience of, everybody has spiritual experiences. Some people don't recognize them as such. They just like nature, or they just like orgasms, or whatever they experience and go beyond themselves. But they just interpret it according to their ego. So that's the second category. And so it's just spiritual experiences, either induced or unbidden. The third is practicing the qualities of true nature. So our true nature has certain qualities. It's kind of like the sun. The sun radiates warmth and light. So the qualities of the sun are warmth and light. And our true nature has certain qualities too. It has love, wisdom, generosity, peace, ethical behavior, selflessness, metta in Buddhism, they call it metta, which is loving kindness, empathy, joy and others' good fortune, equanimity, and various others. Um, so it has all these qualities, and what we can do is we can actually practice these qualities. If we practice these qualities, an interesting thing happens. So you're practicing selflessness, and usually you're pretty selfish. So you're practicing being a service to others, and then it changes your outlook. So instead of being not appreciating or having empathy for other people's suffering, all of a sudden you're opening yourself and being able to see that because you're actually trying. And because you're practicing this, what happens is that you are trying to be empathic, trying to have compassion, practicing compassion, saying the right things, and then all of a sudden you connect with the other person. And this trying all of a sudden changes to spontaneous compassion. And spontaneous compassion comes from our true nature. So by practicing these qualities, what happens is that we make it easier to shift into the actual spontaneous realization of these qualities, no matter what it is. If we practice peace, you're being very peaceful, or you're practicing meditation and just getting your mind still. And then, maybe you're working with your thoughts, and then all of a sudden, spontaneously, you move into a state of perfect peace. So by practicing the qualities of true nature, what happens is that it makes it easier for us to move in to these qualities spontaneously. For example, with the example of compassion, if you're very selfish, what happens is that your walls are so high, it's going to be very difficult for you to notice other people's pain and feel compassion for them because your attention just isn't there. Your attention is on yourself. So practicing these things changes our attention and opens us up to see things that we didn't see before. So this type of practice is very common. One practice that's common in Buddhism is metta, which is really practicing loving kindness. In other religions, praying for people that you feel are hurting in some way. That's practicing one of the qualities of our true nature. So generosity, peace, being ethical. Our true nature is naturally ethical. And a lot of times we practice ethical behavior, it feels good, and then it just becomes natural to us. So when we practice something like this, it may start out as a should. A should is usually coming to something from the ego. The ego decides, I want to practice this, and then we start practicing. I should practice this. And then we practice it, and then it shifts into something spontaneous. So all these practices are very potent, and they can help us discover our true nature. So that's the third one, practicing the qualities of our true nature. The fourth one is discovering directly our true nature. Now this is a little challenging because we can have our true nature pointed out to us. In certain traditions, the true nature is pointed out. It's actually very challenging to point out to someone their true nature. The analogy of space is helpful here. How do we point out space when that's all we look at and look for as objects? People don't look at space. Remember in art class, they said, notice the space. It's what? That was the first time I ever heard of that. I never really noticed space before or paid attention to that. I knew it was there, but I never really attended to it. So when we go into a room, we automatically look at the objects in the room. We hardly ever notice the space. Space is just there. It's always there. Because it's always there, it's not different in any way. We're conditioned for survival to pay attention to differences in our environment, because differences in our environment could mean the difference between survival or not. So we're deeply programmed to pay attention to things changing in our environment rather than things like space or things that are more always with us, like awareness, our true nature, space, vastness, all those things, silence. So the thing is, how do you, one way of pointing this out is being aware of awareness, but how do you become aware of awareness when it's not an object and awareness is everywhere? So, the thing is, if we can see this, it's the fastest method because it's a direct approach. Even if it doesn't trigger an abiding realization, what it can do is it can trigger a practice where we can really understand, at least in a beginning way, what our true nature is, and then take it from there. By practicing it, we can explore it more deeply. There's a couple Tibetan groups that do this, and that's Dzogchen, Mahamudra, and Zen talks a lot about true nature and pointing it out. So it's very difficult for people to recognize this. We're conditioned into a subject-object view of life. It's kind of automatic. Our mind automatically seeks an object. It has been conditioned to see things through a subject-object lens. If I say to become aware of your basic awareness, the tendency will be to make an image of awareness in our mind, or awareness as a conceptual abstraction, and then we will relate to that rather than to actual awareness, which is not an object. So we create an image or an abstraction of what we think awareness must be. Our conceptualizing mind is very habitual, so it's very difficult to get out of this tendency. But, this is the purpose of a teaching like this, is for you to understand that tendency so you can, catch it, so you don't just fall into that and think you know what it is just by thinking. This is a direct experience. So if we can have the direct experience of our true nature, we can examine it. And as we examine it, what we begin to realize is that this is who we truly are. It's not what we thought we are. And as we realize that more and more, there's a shift that happens. And the shift that happens is that we are no longer centered in the ego, and now we're centered in true nature. True nature is the pure subject. Called a pure subject because it's beyond subject-object. It's like turning inward and looking at what's looking, being aware of what's being aware. It's non-dual in the sense that there isn't any duality. There's no subject-object. Subject-object is duality. So it's like looking at the gold, looking at the sun, the sky, or looking at space directly, and just doing that without any other practices in between. Typically, people do all these practices, and all these practices are helpful, because if we're not seeing our true nature directly, then we're getting rid of some of the obscurations. And these obscurations, even though they're just thoughts and not really existent because they're mistaken ideas, we still have to see through them. Otherwise, they determine how we look at life. So we need to see through them and see what's real. So the 4R again are remove our mistaken and limited ideas through insight, induce an experience of true nature or have an unbidden experience of true nature, practice the qualities of true nature, and discover true nature directly. Typically that needs to be pointed out to us. There are actually some teachings and books that point this out directly. So a lot of Advaita Vedanta teachers point to our true nature directly. There's also things like the Uttara Tantra, which is all about Buddha nature, which is a Buddhist text. So you can find out about it in many different ways. So those are the four, and if you practice these things, what will happen is that you will find you'll be like the woman who found the gold. You will wash the gold, get the dirt off of it, and see its radiant quality. That radiant quality is you. So good luck. I hope this is helpful. Bye bye.